One of my favourite tools in Illustrator has to be the eraser tool. You may think that sounds like a very simple tool, but you can do so many things with it, and we're going to have a look at some of those here. Now, if you select the eraser tool, you can double click it and you can choose different sizes. You can add pressure sensitivity to it if you want to, or you can keep it fixed. And there are all sorts of settings in here that you can use to adjust the brush. But we're going to keep it on a pretty standard round brush. And what I want to do is show you that if I click and drag across artwork, I basically delete areas from the artwork. And if we go to our View menu and say Show Transparency Grid, you can see what I've deleted. Now, if you want to follow along and have a practice with this, you can open up Eraser Skull Start AI. And I'm in the number 2 artboard. So you need to have your artboards panel open from the window menu and your layers panel open. So let's do that again. So if you want to follow along, just select the eraser tool. And this time, before I click and drag, I'm going to hold down the Shift key. And when I hold down the Shift key, I drag diagonals. So I can create diagonal or straight edges depending on how I drag. Now I could also just click once with the eraser tool and create little bites out of this apple. So that's another way of using it, or we could create a cog by creating that kind of cutout shape. So lots and lots of things that you can do just by clicking and dragging and clicking once repeatedly with the eraser tool. I'm going to undo those last few steps. Now you'll notice that when I click and drag with nothing selected, it affects all of the layers. If I was just to select the rectangle and then click and drag, you'll notice now it only erases from the rectangle. It doesn't erase from the circle. So it will work on selected objects, or if you have nothing selected, so let's deselect, it will work on everything. So let's leave our practice artboard and go to our skull, and we'll come back to the practice artboard a bit later. So how can we use it on this? Well, we have our knife layer selected, which has the skull on it. If I toggle that on and off, there's my skull. I've got this picture of a skull next to it to use as reference. And what I want to do is make it look more skull-like. Now, at the moment, if I use it, it's going to erase everything. I don't really want that to happen. So what I'm going to do is hold down a modifier, which is the Command key on Mac or Control key on Windows, and select just the jaw. And with just the jaw selected, if I click and drag, I can start to create his bottom jaw. Okay, so create a more square bottom jaw. Okay, now I can use a round brush. If I wanted to, I could use a squarer brush by going into the brush settings and just adjusting it and choosing something a little less round. So if I want to, create gaps for his teeth, for example, instead of building the teeth, what I can do is click to create little gaps between his teeth. And we can create one that's broken there. So there's a broken tooth. Now, let's go back to a round brush. So all the way up to round. And I can use the left and right square bracket keys to make my brush bigger or smaller. So I'm going to choose quite a big brush and just cut a little section out here. It's quite good to use the eraser tool with quite big brushes, because then you can get nice curved shapes. You notice there, if my brush is too small, I'm getting lots of ridges. So if I undo that a few times and select a bigger brush, I can just click on here and get a really nice curve. And the same on that side, just click on here and get a nice curve in his jaw. Okay, just take a little bit more out of there. Okay, so you'll see we can literally carve shapes using the eraser tool, and it's great fun to play around with. So have a little practice on that. We're also going to adjust the skull a little bit, the top half of the skull. So I can hold down my modifier, Command key on Mac, Control key on Windows, select the skull. We can maybe take a little bit out there, a little bit out here, and then we could select these shapes, the eye, for example, and if we needed to, we can use it to carve the shape of the eye. In fact, I'm going to use it on the nose, and I'm going to create a much smaller shape and just remove those edges off the nose, make it a more organic shape, and we're also going to cut a little bit out of the bottom there. So we're creating that shape of the nose. So that's how you can use the eraser to help sculpt shapes on the skull. Let's double click our artboard again, the second artboard, to go back to our practice. And I want to show you a couple of tricks. So with the eraser tool selected, if I double click on it, we'll make a much bigger brush. So we'll create it about 100 in size, maybe a little bit smaller, so using the left and right bracket keys just to get it right. If I want to create, say, a roll of film and a strip of film, what I can do over here is just click to create circles, round in a circle, and cut them out of my main shape. Now, obviously this isn't exactly accurate, but if I'm creating a kind of rough cartoon, it would be accurate enough for that. And very quickly, I've created a wheel for me to put my film strip on. So this is like a projection wheel. And if I want to create a strip of film, I can also do that. So I'm going to this time double click the eraser tool and create a completely flat brush. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger and click OK. Move it over here and you can see the width of the brush there. Now, when I'm working with a pen, I get a lot of pressure sensitivity and it also picks up angles really easily. So if I hold down Shift and click and draw an angle, I can create these lovely kind of chevron shapes, which is a nice thing to do. But I actually want to click down and do a vertical. And sometimes with the pen, it's too accurate. It picks up too many slight changes in direction and creates an angled brush. So if I want to create a completely vertical or horizontal brush, I'm better to use the mouse. So I've switched to the mouse, hold down Shift and click and drag down. What we're doing is creating the main frames of the film strip. Now I haven't placed it directly in the middle, so if I want to adjust it, I can double click on that and enter isolation mode. And that allows me to select the shape and just nudge it into position a little bit. I can also duplicate it, so if I hold down the Alt key, I can click and drag that shape down and I create another hole. So I'm duplicating my eraser tool. Now you'll notice when I drag it down here, I start to get oddities happening, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But that's a really good way of being able to duplicate areas. And of course, if I go back to here, out of isolation mode by clicking on the arrow button, I can select a smaller brush and remove little squares as well on the edges to create the little sprockets for the film. And again, if I go into isolation mode, instead of creating multiple ones, I can just duplicate that one. So we can very quickly create this kind of film strip. So have a think about how you can use the eraser tool in non-standard ways to create repeating shapes and patterns.